Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today for this second webinar of the Fair for All series. So today it is Tools and Rules, AI for Innovative Language Instruction, Guidelines for Instructors, and Ethical Considerations. My name is Florence. I'm the Sector Engagement Lead at the Atlantic Region Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies, also known as ARAISA. If you're not familiar with ARAISA, we are a nonprofit umbrella organization that supports your organization in the important work of helping to settle and integrate newcomers into our communities. We also serve as a collective voice, and forum for members in the Atlantic region. All right, so today we have interpretation available. The meeting will be in English, but if you'd like to have interpretation in French, you can click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language, French or English. All right, and I will now introduce our speakers. So today we are very lucky to have Kelly and Paul join us to deliver this webinar. Kelly Boland is a team lead and instructor at ISANS. She holds a Bachelor of Education and TESOL diploma and brings over a decade of experience teaching English as an additional language across diverse settings. Passionate about the intersection of language and technology, Kelly is dedicated to empowering newcomers to Canada through language and exploring innovative teaching strategies along the way. And Paul is also a team lead and instructor at ISANS. He is responsible for onboarding new language instructors, developing ongoing professional development workshops, and providing ongoing support for a team of over 20 instructors. He is also an instructor himself at the Western Halifax Community Learning Network, where his focus is on helping students with their digital literacy skills and GED preparation. He holds a Master of Education and an MBA from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Well, Kelly and Paul, welcome. Thanks for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And welcome to everyone. Thanks for coming. We just wanted to start with the land acknowledgement. So we will recognize that we're on unceded traditional Mi'kmaq territory, and we're grateful for the peace and friendship treaties. At ISANS, as we work to settle newcomers in Nova Scotia, we honor and respect the Indigenous people of this land. Since October is Mi'kmaq History Month, if you are joining us today from Mi'kma'ki, I would encourage you to check out what events are happening in your area to celebrate. So just a little bit about our agenda for today. So we're going to start off with just a little introduction to us and ISANS and give you a bit of background and context for the webinar today. And then we'll look at some session objectives, and we'll get into the good stuff, the tools and the rules, which we've outlined on this slide, but we'll get into in a lot more detail as we move through the presentation. So at ISANS, we're dedicated to our mission of helping immigrants build a future in Nova Scotia, and our vision to have a community where all can belong and grow. Paul and I both work in the Language Services Department, which employs about 140 people and serves many, many clients. We support clients in meeting their goals through various community and employment-based language programs. Paul and I are both team leads and instructors, so that means we work directly with clients and supporting our colleagues. I'm going to pass it over to Paul to talk a little bit more about the context and the scope of our session today.
Okay, so our presentation today will show you how to use ChatGPT. But I think the prompts that we'll discuss or the guidance on the prompts will be helpful even if you use other AI. Our presentation is most suited for those who are relatively newer to using AI. So if you've got tons of experience, you know, I hope that you'll still find it useful. But if you're newer, I think you'll find it the most useful. The real uses of ChatGPT that we will share today are useful for language instructors, and specifically those using the Canadian language benchmarks and involved with real-world tasks in their teaching. Additionally, the examples that I'll show you today are for the most part from CLBs 3+. But I think even if you teach literacy or CLBs 1 and 2, you will find some use to our workshop today. The scope of our presentation does not include student use or how to manage that. This workshop is mostly involves how to help language instructors be efficient, save time, generate ideas, and reflect on their teaching practices. And of course, I would like to say at this point, and I will repeat myself going forward, the examples that I show you today, you cannot completely trust what AI produces. You still need to use that CLB book. So this is not a replacement of this CLB book. It's to help you save a little bit of time and be more efficient in your work. And Kelly, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. I also think we should mention that if you do have any questions as we're talking, you're welcome to put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them as we go through, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end as well. So before we get into the tools and the rules, I just want to contextualize the presentation a little bit further by talking briefly about Avenue's standards for technology-enhanced language learning and kind of recognizing how these standards help to guide the development of what we're sharing with you today. So you can see on the slide here, we've got the cover of the Instructor Standards document, and there were actually 3 documents published earlier this year in English. One is the standards for learners, one is for instructors, and one is for programs. You can also see I've got the French cover included there, which is actually hot off the presses. The French version of the program standards has been published, but the standards for learners and instructors are to be released this fall. So they're coming very, very soon. So this kind of provides guidelines for technology-enhanced language learning in the Canadian settlement language programs. It's a tool for both instructors and administrators to evaluate their use of technology and identify opportunities for growth. And I would encourage you to keep an eye on the avenue.ca homepage. That's where you can find the publications in full, and that's where you'll find the French ones as they're released this fall. On this slide, I've copied from the Instructor Standards documents kind of the guiding philosophy for tech use in classrooms. So I think that applying this philosophy to our use of artificial intelligence can help us to overcome barriers. It encourages us to make thoughtful decisions about the use of technology in classes and persist in the face of frustration. So I think we've all had that experience where we're like, learn about some new tech that we think is really exciting. We think about how we're going to use it in the classroom. We try it out with the class and it just does not go as planned. So this kind of encouraged us to think about what went wrong, what went right, and then give it one more chance if you think it has value for you and your learners. On the next slide, it's going to talk a little bit more about the performance standards. So there are 7 standards for instructors. On this slide and the following slide, you'll see that I've copied them so you can kind of take a preview of what they are, but I'm not going to read through them in detail. Like I said, I do encourage you to go to the Avenue homepage, have a look at the document and look at the more detailed version of this. Even though they're made by New Language Solutions, the folks at Avenue, they are available to the public and mostly applicable whether or not you're actually using Avenue if you're in the settlement language sector. Looking at the standards might seem a little bit kind of overwhelming. It's a lot to take in. But by coming to the session today, you're actually already addressing a lot of these standards. And each of the standards has kind of performance indicators that are associated with it. So the standards are kind of the what, where the performance indicators are the how. And they apply across the use of new and existing technology. So when I went through the instructor standards, I picked out the 3 specific standards that had performance indicators directly connected to the use of AI. And actually, we've decided to use those 3 things as our objectives for today's session because they really did connect to what we were already planning. So our session objectives, I guess the main thing that we're hoping to accomplish is to spark some ideas on how thoughtful use of AI can support you as an instructor, and as a result, can help your learners. To have kind of a brief overview of some of the legal and ethical concerns as they relate to our role as instructors. And Paul will talk about using ChatGPT specifically to create effective prompts to support your work. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the ethical concerns to start. And keeping in mind, there are numerous ethical concerns surrounding AI, from the environmental impact of supercomputers that are used to train and run the systems, to the biases that can affect sectors like law enforcement and education. But the 4 that we've kind of picked out today are chosen because through conversations with colleagues, these are the things that kind of stood out, being raised frequently and having this kind of connection to what we do as language instructors. So they're here, but presented in really no particular order. The first one we have is balancing technology with human expertise. So this is a question that I've heard from a few people. Will more productivity be expected of instructors with access to AI? i.e., will we have reduced prep time? Will we lose our jobs to computers? Can we be replaced? So although learner interaction with AI can help with a lot of areas of language acquisition, AI is not going to replace us as teachers anytime soon. But it is going to change our role. So in UNESCO's report on AI in education for policymakers, they assert that AI should be used to empower teachers to enhance learning. They also note that teachers play an essential social role in the learning process. So that means that we don't need just like ongoing PD about technical skills. We also need to build on our human and social capabilities to better support our learners and kind of differentiate ourselves from what's available with just a computer, and to use those tools available with technology to help us. So balancing technology and human expertise means recognizing the power of AI as a tool for instructors to support their own skills and development. Ready for the next slide there, Paul? So the next thing that is an ethical concern that we hear about a lot, and this one is probably the most talked about among instructors because really it's quite complicated. Safeguarding intellectual property and data privacy. And you can see from my image there, it really opens up a whole can of worms. I'm just going to give a kind of short overview of some of the things that I think would apply to us as language teachers. So a lot of people have expressed concerns about the copyright implications of using the output of generative AI. So this is a legitimate concern because generative AI is trained on copyright materials. There are active lawsuits going on about this in the States. However, AI companies are going to bat to ensure that they're involved in any lawsuits that are going to set the legal precedent in this uncharted territory. A lot of AI companies actually are offering legal protection for some users, specifically paid users, to protect them against any lawsuits that might result from this. So without any clear legal precedent, I guess my recommendation is to follow the ethical guidelines of being transparent about your use of AI to generate materials used with your learners, and include the original source where it's appropriate and possible. This can be done using a statement stating which AI was used and in what capacity. And we're seeing a lot of publishers use this kind of as their guidelines. They're asking their writers, their authors to have kind of a transparency statement about their use of AI. And I think modeling this transparency will also encourage learners to do the same. Another key consideration here is protecting the intellectual property and data of our learners. Consider how using tools to detect plagiarism or to grade work might infringe on the intellectual property or privacy of our learners. This was also one of the key concerns that was raised in that same UNESCO report on AI in education, which stated that that all learners are susceptible to having their personal data misused or compromised. So this is something that we just kind of need to be aware of. Although as educators, we really should be looking to our institutions for kind of acceptable guidance and use. I think generative AI is still in its infancy, and we can expect kind of more clarity on this as time goes on. If we compare it to the evolution of online music and movies, AI is sort of like in its Napster era right now. And we need to see how things play out over the next several years. So even now, 25 years after Napster's launch, how we access media online legally and ethically, it's more established, but still evolving. And I think we can expect the same thing of AI.
Before we move on from that, Kelly, we had a comment in the chat from Megan, who says, I'm disappointed that environmental impact didn't make the top 4 for ethical concerns. It's my #1 concern, and I'm not ready to go back to using AI until I hear it addressed in a rigorous way.
I think that's a legitimate concern. I'll say the reason that we chose not to include it is that it doesn't have kind of a specific application to what we're doing as instructors, whereas the 4 that we've chosen, we can kind of talk about in a practical context. That being said, I was listening to a podcast on the weekend that was talking about how Microsoft actually bought a nuclear power plant to help power their AI computers. So it's definitely something that's becoming more of a concern in the wider context, but it's not included here as it's not kind of specific to instructors. But yeah, I totally agree, Megan. Thank you. All right. So on this next slide, we're talking about recognizing bias and misinformation. So ChatGPT, in their frequently asked questions, actually recognizes, and I quote, that it's not free from biases and stereotypes, so users and educators should carefully review its content. As language instructors, we should be aware that it kind of skews toward a Western view. It can reinforce user biases. So if you input something that's biased, it can kind of amplify that as the conversation goes back and forth. And it comes from a system that benefits people with privilege and power. So critical thinking skills are essential for identifying misinformation and hallucinations. Hallucinations can happen, like if AI doesn't know the answer to something, it'll make something up, or sometimes it just gives us misinformation. So I've included an example here, which comes from Canva's Magic Media. So basically I put in the prompt, a good student sits at a desk in the classroom, a bad student sits in the desk of the classroom, and you can see, quite shockingly, there is some bias that comes through in these pictures. And I just kind of included that as an example of something that we need to look out for. All right, so on the next 2 slides, we're looking at kind of equitable access. This slide is from the instructor perspective, but also from our learners' perspective as well. So for instructors, this means thinking about, do we have access to devices like laptops, smartboards, etc.? Do we have the digital skills or training to acquire the digital skills? that we need to use AI effectively? And do we have access to paid services? So a lot of these AI services require subscription. So how can we ensure that, I guess, instructors have equitable access to this? From the learner side, ensuring equitable access is also about making sure that they have access to the right devices, ensuring that they have access to reliable internet, and like with instructors, that they have the right training with the digital skills, and also considering accessibility needs. As Paul goes through the different ideas and examples of AI use for instructors, we'll have a chance to revisit these ethical concerns kind of in a more practical context. So I'm going to pass it over to Paul to talk about some of the tools.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so we are going to discuss 4 different tools or 4 different uses of AI. They aren't necessarily mutually exclusive from one another, but depending on what materials you already have or don't have, you might want to use one or more of these uses. So the first use is creating skill building activities. The second is creating assessments or skill using. The third is planning, perhaps an entire module or at least a lesson. And the fourth is engaging in self-reflection. So as we go through each of these 4, I will show you, a number of ideas for each and an example of a real prompt that I used. I'll show you what ChatGPT produced, and then Kelly will bring it all together and connect this use or this tool to the ethical implications that she has introduced. Before we get into the first one, I wanted to show you some guidance for prompts for AI. There's lots of ways to go about doing this, and there's lots of different approaches, and perhaps trial and error is your best bet. But this is an approach that you'll see a lot online and one that I've played around with and I've used. And I think it's a pretty good standard approach. With this approach, the first step in your prompt for ChatGPT is to identify the role. Then you identify or clarify what the task is, what you want AI to do, and that's more generally. The third part is to include the requirements. So that's, the specific parameters that you want it to work within, if you will. And then fourth, include the instructions. So that's the way you want the output to be, how you want it to look. For example, maybe you want a table or a timeline or a calendar or, an ad. Alternatively, instructions could be, how you want it to be in terms of voice or tone or something to that effect. I will admit that sometimes, the difference between requirements and instructions is not totally clear to me. And, I'm not sure that it actually matters. So, perhaps we could call it one category and be done with it. But either way, again, I think playing around with your prompts and being very clear, making mistakes, and then trying it again to get what you want is the way to go. Okay, so let's get to it with the first tool or idea in this case. So that's creating skill building activities. So when we talk about skill building activities, I'm talking about all your classic activities, like filling in the blank, identifying things, labeling things, matching, categorization, ranking, error correction. However you do your skill building, you can use AI for that. So I've 2 ways of approaching this. With the first one here, you'll see it's identifying skill building activities based on criteria or text. So in this case, you kind of know what the task is or where you're going. You just want to know how to get there. So you don't have the skill building in mind yet. You want to generate some ideas. But the second point here is you know exactly what you want. I want a fill in the blank. Give me my fill in the blank. So you know what you want. You just want AI to make it in this case. Okay, let's look at a real world example. And this is a case where I know what I want, and I'm going to ask AI to produce it. So the role here, we're going to take the approach that I showed a moment ago. So I'll show you the role, task, requirements, and instructions. So imagine this is one prompt. We want AI or ChatGPT to act as an English language instructor for a CLB3 class. Create a skill building activity that helps students practice using irregular verbs when describing what they did last weekend. That's our task. Here are the requirements. The activity will include 10 sentences. All sentences start with I and relate to describing last weekend. Again, you can, if you want to be even more specific, this is where you could do it. If you want if you know exactly what verbs you want to use, this is probably where you'll mention that. Or if you want all your sentences to be related to, I don't know, maybe health or physical activity that you did last weekend, this is where you can, make those specifications. And finally, the instructions. So I want the activity to be a fill in the blank. There will be a blank where the past version of the verb would be. So I want a blank space. After that, immediately after that blank, I want the infinitive form of the verb in parentheses. And I want each of the 10 sentences to be numbered. It's important here that I added the word immediately because I think the first time, if I remember correctly, the verb was at the end of the sentence and I wanted it right next to the blank. Okay, so let's look at what ChatGPT produced. I took what it produced and I put it in a document here that I could share. So here is what it produced, which looks, to me, looks great. It's exactly what I wanted. The sentences are pretty good. The verb is where I wanted. The blank is where I wanted. I think it's a classic, a classic skill building activity for practicing simple past. Okay, so let's now, we're going to stick with skill building for another moment, but let's imagine you teach an online class and instead of having what we just produce, which I suppose you could copy and paste into, maybe an assignment or a quiz or a wiki in an online class. You could also make an H5P. So I wanted to show you how you can change your prompt so that ChatGPT will produce code or text that you can then just paste right into an H5P. I think many people on this, here today are probably use Avenue or maybe some other, Moodle-based platforms. So H5Ps are great for, creating some interactivity in those courses or those classes. So I kept most of my prompt the same. The only thing I changed was the instruction where I stated that I wanted the output to be used as code for making an H5P. And instead of having a blank, I wanted a star before and after the word, before and after the correct answer. So let's look at what ChatGPT produced for making an H5P. So here's the text. It has the star before and after, which is great. I found that with ChatGPT, you can't actually see the stars. It looks like the word is in italics, but then when you paste it into a document, the stars will appear. So this is the text that I then pasted into the H5P to produce this fill in the blank H5P. If you're familiar with H5Ps, you'll know that you can use the same text to create different types of H5Ps. So for example, the text for fill in the blank is the same as drag the words, which is the same as mark the words. So I took the same text from here, and then I made a second H5P. This one is drag the words, where the answers are at the bottom, and you move them up. In this case, perhaps maybe I don't want, do I want the verb there in parentheses? Yeah, I think that's maybe for the first skill building, perhaps. Yeah. Okay, so that's skill building for H5Ps. And now I'll hand it back to Kelly.
Yeah, so Paul, I think that's a great example and a really neat way to save time when you're creating skill building activities. I do think that we also need to look at, from the perspective of ensuring equitable access. Do all learners have access to a device where they can practice online activities like H5Ps? Do instructors have access to training and creating H5Ps or an LMS that can host these activities? And by reflecting on these questions and their broader implications, you can see that inequities in student access could create a divide within your class. So maybe some learners have more opportunity to practice than others, while unequal access for teachers could lead to unrealistic expectations for those who don't have access to these tools or hinder their ability to provide the same quality of instruction. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't use the tools. But we should think about ways of kind of leveling the playing field. So for example, maybe advocating for more training or for more devices at your institution. And then Paul's going to talk about creating assessments next.
Okay, so here's our second use of AI, that's creating an assessment or a skill using activity as well. Let's start with receptive tasks first. So you might use AI to create texts for reading assessments from scratch, or you could use AI to modify existing texts so that they align with the CLB that you teach or any other requirements. Second, you might use AI to create dialogues for listening assessments. You might even use AI to create the audio, but we won't get into that today. If your assessment involves a conversation, you might use AI to generate a model of what that conversation might look like as well. Third, consider using AI to slightly modify existing assessments to create a skill using activity or vice versa. So, especially at the intermediate levels, you want some slight differences between your skill using activity and your assessment. So AI can help you with that. And finally, try using AI to create comprehension questions for receptive tasks, if that's how you're going to assess your listening or reading. And now for productive tasks, here are some possible ideas. This is for speaking or writing. You can use AI to generate ideas on what might be suitable criteria for your speaking or writing assessment. But again, this is one of those cases where you should absolutely consult with your CLB book. Second, you could have AI generate a rubric for your productive assessment. It'll spit out a table with the criteria and the point value and so on. Third, you can create a dialogue for multi-turn assessment. So let's imagine it's, a writing assessment where there's back and forth between, I don't know, maybe a tenant and a landlord, and the learner has to only fill in their part. So you could use AI to generate that kind of a dialogue. And finally, if you have an assessment or a criteria or a rubric for a particular task, but it's not for the CLB you teach, but you really want to use it, you can modify the criteria so it suits your CLB. So let's look at it.
Interrupt, Paul.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, there's a question in the chat from Jerry. Couldn't we input the book as a PDF to help with creating rubrics?
So are we talking about the CLB book and using the information in there to produce a rubric that we could be more certain would actually work for us? Is that right?
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's I think that's a great idea. And in fact, if it's not this example, the next one, I do include links to documents like that. I don't think I use the CLB book specifically, but perhaps I should have. But that's a great idea. Absolutely. Okay, let's look at this specific example here. Again, I'll take it through the four-pronged approach for your prompts. The role, again, is you are an English language instructor. The task is we want to create a reading text for assessing CLB4 and also create the comprehension questions for that task. Here, yes, this is exactly what I just mentioned. The requirements for this task are the output should be based on this document, Renting a Home in Canada. It's from the Canadian government and it's specifically written for newcomers. If you're using ChatGPT, you'll want to paste in the URL. I just did it this way to save space. I want the output to be about 1 page because that's what's suitable for this CLB. I want 10 comprehension questions, some literal, some interpretive, and some applied. And I included a link to a document called Integrating CLB Assessment into Your ESL Classroom that comes from the Canadian Centre for Canadian Language Benchmarks. Just in case AI needed some guidance on how to create appropriate questions. And I also clarified that I wanted a mixture of multiple choice, short answer, true and false, and so on. Okay, and finally, the instructions. I wanted a summary of the text. I wanted to include the most important details. I wanted headings and subheadings. I wanted the reading at the top and the questions after, of course. The questions should be numbered. And multiple choice should use letters. Okay, let's have a look at the reading. Okay, so it is about 1 page. Now I will show you a brief excerpt of the original content from the website, but I wanted to show you what it produced first. So it's it's okay. It's a bit consistent in terms of the headings, and it's consistent in the formatting. It's like a heading and then a paragraph. There's not a lot of variety here, and the summary is almost too good. All of the good details that we might want to use in our comprehension questions or get in the answers for our comprehension questions they've been eliminated. So if I scroll down a little bit more, you'll see here's an excerpt from the original text. You can see the formatting is a lot more complex. We've got headings and bullet points and different kinds of bullet points and a lot of good details that we would want to probably assess which are missing in the summary at the top. I think the issue is probably the word summary. Perhaps I could have, you know, been a little bit more specific in the requirements and maybe paraphrase. Perhaps I should have been more specific about what is, you know, what details I found to be the most important. I also want to show you the comprehension questions, which are not great. I found that ChatGPT had some difficulty in giving great interpretive and applied questions. Most of the questions you see here are in fact literal. And there's one, if not two cases of questions where the answer is not in the reading at all. So that's a serious problem. So you'll definitely want to review what ChatGPT produces in this case. And then perhaps modify your prompts or edit the results yourself so that you get what you want. Okay, I'm back over to Kelly.
Yeah, so I think your example is a great demonstration of how we can use the chat AI to adapt a text to be suitable for our class or to generate a text. When you're doing this, it's important to be transparent about your use of AI and give proper credit to the original source where appropriate. So for example, the text that you use that you adapted, you could include something like the source adapted by ChatGPT. And of course, if you're using ChatGPT to create something that's kind of new and not adapted, you don't really know who the author of that is, but it's still important to be transparent about your use of AI and that it was generated using AI. There's also some considerations when looking at the materials produced through the lens of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. One example that I've run into when creating dialogues is the names assigned to the speakers in the dialogues are almost always English names, which don't reflect the diversity of our classrooms and of our country as a whole. They often also reflect gender stereotypes. So, for example, in a dialogue between a manager and an employee, the manager, I've tried a couple times and, you know, it's Michael, it's David. So just be aware of that and think about how you can change your prompts to get something that's a bit more reflective of the reality of our world. Yeah, so I'll hand it back to you, Paul, to talk about planning.
Before we move on, there's another question in the chat from Julia, who says, what are your thoughts on using Roshi AI instead of ChatGPT? It has specific CLB related parameters.
Paul, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Yeah, I have used Roshi quite a bit, Kelly and I, and I think Roshi is amazing and it produces all kinds of great things. Some things that ChatGPT can do and a lot of things that it can't. But the reason that we're not including Roshi today is because there's a session coming up where that's going to be the main topic. So we didn't want to overlap with that, but we think Roshi is great.
Okay, good. Good to know.
Okay, let's move on to the third use of AI that we wanted to talk about, and that's planning. So you might use AI to identify real world tasks based on a theme or a skill or a competency. So you know generally what you want to do, but you don't know exactly the task. So it's kind of like brainstorming, like give me some ideas of what I could possibly do for the health theme or the education theme or whatever the theme might be. A second, you might use AI to generate teachable concepts. So, you know, that might be grammar points or vocabulary or formatting or whatever you could possibly teach. So you know the task in this case, like maybe you have a reading or a dialogue, but you want AI to help you identify what are the most important concepts that I should teach so that my learners will truly be able to understand it or to be able to do it. And finally, you can use AI to create the entire lesson plan, either for a module over the course of a week or more, or maybe for just one day. It depends. But in either case, before I continue, again, you must consult the CLB book in all of these cases to make sure that you're on the right track. Okay, let's look at a specific example for planning. Here is the first half of the prompt. You are an English language instructor teaching CLB 4. Create a lesson plan for the following real-world task. It's giving directions on how to get from the Halifax Central Library to the art gallery. Classic real-world task. In this case, for my plan, I already know my requirements. Because it's speaking, I've already identified the criteria that I think are most important. And as you can see the 4 of them here, we've got prepositions, imperatives, sequence words, and pronunciation and fluency. For each of these 4 criteria, I want AI to produce 5 skill-building activities. And for each criteria, I want the skill-building activities to start with the easiest one and then increase in difficulty. So classic scaffolding, right? Start at the easiest and build on that. And finally, my instructions. And forgive me, I know there's a lot of text on many of these slides, but it's hard to talk about prompts and show results without having a lot of text. So I want the output to be a table. There has to be rows and columns. I want each day of this module or lesson plan to be its own table. I want a timetable that tells me how long and when to do each skill building activity. I included how long the class is, 2.5 hours a day, and that there are 20 students in this class. The class will not work on just one criteria at a time. They're going to simultaneously work on all of them. The final day is an assessment day, so no skill building that day. And the day before that, the second to last day, will be a practice day, so skill using. So no skill building on that day either. Okay, let's look at what ChatGPT produced. Okay, so here's day 1. You can see the columns here of time, activity, focused criteria, and skill building activity description. So I was, I'm pretty impressed with what it produced. I didn't specifically ask for this column, for the timetable to include the connection between the criteria and the skill building activity. So I was pretty happy with that. The timing here seems reasonable, although the first time I played around with this, the timing was way too quick and I had to ask ChatGPT to double it. That's day 1. We've got day 2, day 3, four, and day 5. Notice here that on day 5, which is the practice day, the focus criteria includes all the criteria, as it should, because they're really doing the task now. They're not focusing on any one given criteria. And day 6 here is the assessment day. So I'm pretty happy with what it produced, and I've played around with this and with other tasks, and what it produced was even better. if I could be critical about this result, it's that I don't think it starts, even though I think the scaffolding is pretty good, I don't think it starts at the right entry point. Like it starts a little bit too far into the lesson, I think. For example, they're going to practice forming simple sentences with these verbs, within the first 2 hours. Like, what do those verbs mean? Perhaps we should do that first. So I think the scaffolding is good, but we could start at an easier point for this task, I think. The other thing that I could be critical about with this result is that it's nowhere is it really that specific to Halifax, even though I said I wanted to, the directions are from the Halifax Library to the art gallery, but that's not really found in here. So it may not be specific enough. But again, you can play around with that. And those things would come up in the skill building activities as you progress. Okay, and back to you, Kelly, for the ethical implications.
I see there's a question in the chat about
Oh.
clients' use of AI. And if there's an upcoming session about that. To be honest, I'm not sure of all the upcoming sessions. There's one a month for the next several months. So I'd suggest checking out what the topics of them are. But if you have concerns about that, specifically at ISANS, you can talk to your supervisor. But I think we should be turning to our institutions for the policies around client use of AI and the concerns that have obviously come up around plagiarism and that sort of thing. In terms of planning, I think Paul's example is connected nicely to balancing technology with human expertise. He had in the Halifax Library and the art gallery, but the output that ChatGPT gave him didn't have that kind of specific connection to our local area. And I think that, that's where we come in as instructors. So we can converse with AI to customize what it comes up with. And of course, use our judgment and knowledge to make edits. We need to check all of the output carefully to make sure it's level appropriate. And I guess at the end of the day, AI doesn't know your class, you do. For example, one thing that AI might overlook is the need to take a trauma-informed approach in the classroom. The vast majority of the data that it would be trained on would likely come from a different context than what we teach in. So this is where you would apply your knowledge to approach the lesson in a way that would meet the needs of your class. And we'll go back to Paul to talk about using AI for self-reflection.
Okay, and here is our fourth and final use. This one is, quite different than the three we've talked about so far. This one involves engaging in self-reflection. So you might consider using AI to act as a coach or supervisor, and then have a dialogue with it. AI can maybe give you some guidance and advice. And I want to mention now that this was an idea that I borrowed or outright stole from my colleague, Rocio. Rocio, I don't know if you're on this call, but I want to give a shout out to her because we had a workshop for our English in the Workplace program, and she introduced us to this idea, and we all thought it was pretty cool. So you can engage with AI and perhaps ask AI if what you produced yourself is good or is suitable for your CLB, or if they have any suggestions or recommendations for something that you in fact have made and that you put in your prompt. Alternatively, as I mentioned, it can be a conversation between you and ChatGPT where you get some advice. So let's have a look at a real world example that I actually did. So the role here, you are an experienced English language instructor and coach for other language instructors. The task is to engage me in conversation to reflect on my recent teaching experience, offer guidance and practical advice. For requirements, I asked ChatGPT to use Jim Scrivener's work on teaching English as an additional language. And finally, for instructions, I added, use an informal and friendly tone, but be professional. Be inquisitive and ask questions. Okay, so let's look at my conversation. Okay, so what I think is really interesting here is that this wasn't the first time that I attempted this with ChatGPT. And you'll remember from my prompt, I never said specifically what I wanted to even talk about. But once I entered the prompt, it took into account what we had talked about before. So you'll notice here it's asking me, how's everything going with your classes lately? And how are they, your students, responding to the direction giving activities, for example? And here, how do you think your approach to giving instructions has evolved? So this is what I had talked about weeks and weeks and weeks before. That's the specific topic I wanted some guidance on, and it's following up with me on that, even though I didn't ask it to. So I don't know if that's amazing or if it's scary, but you can see that it's taking that into account. So, I mean, we don't have time, of course, to read the entire conversation, but you can see here, I'm responding. ChatGPT is giving me advice, asking for some specifics. We go back and forth. Finally, I asked for some good advice for online. Maybe that's a little bit further. Oh, here it is. For giving it instructions online, and it gives me some really good advice here. So I think that's another, interesting use of ChatGPT. At least it's interesting to me, and certainly different than the other three practical uses that we talked about first.
And Paul,
And
there's
back to
another
you, Kelly.
question in the
Oh,
chat
yeah.
there. It says, how well does GPT know the CLBs? Is just saying what level we're teaching sufficient?
I have personally found, or I have been very surprised actually that it seems to have a reasonably good understanding of the CLBs. If I were to take a longer document, like a 3 or 4 page document and ask it to turn into one, well, we looked at an example of that. It does a pretty good job, of modifying the language, making it suitable for that CLB. I don't know, Kelly, I think you've found the same.
Yeah, in general, I mean, you have to double check things. Sometimes I'll throw in the CFR level as well, just to make it perfectly clear. Another thing that I've tried that has been somewhat successful, if I know which competency I'm targeting, I'll just copy the information about that competency and from the CLB book, so that instead of having the whole book to process, it knows exactly what I want it to focus on. So I've had some success with that as well. Patrick also has a question in the chat. It says, do you occasionally clear the chat thread, or does ChatGPT have your chat stored for reflection?
I personally I don't think I've ever cleared it, although I've been told, probably by you, Kelly, that I probably should. I don't know if that's the case. What do you think?
I think clearing it or using it with the incognito window can give you a fresh start, which might be useful in some situations. But also, I do like that it knows some of the things that I've said in the past, because it sometimes gives it a better idea of what I'm looking for with the current prompt. So I think it can work to your advantage in some situations, but also in other situations where you're like, it seems to be stuck on something, it's not quite what you want. Clearing that can help get it to where you want it to be, if that makes sense. All right, so I guess, yeah, in terms of the ethical implications with self-reflection, I think this one connects again nicely to balancing technology with human expertise. So it's a really powerful way to use this tool, is to, you know, look at how we can improve our own practice. Obviously, we take the advice with kind of a critical eye, but it can definitely give us some interesting ideas. It's not going to replace the conversations that we have with colleagues. I think even the fact that we've included this because Paul had a conversation with a colleague about using ChatGPT for self-reflection is evident of that. But as Paul demonstrated, it can definitely spark some ideas for professional growth. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming, and we are happy to answer questions, have a further discussion. If you have anything you'd like to add, you're welcome to put it in the chat or to raise your hand and turn on your microphone.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly and Paul. We'll just give it a minute. I think I see some hands popping up. So Dana, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I had a question sort of regarding copyright and like authors protection. And you may have touched on this already, so if I'm repeating something that was already clarified, I apologize. I don't know if I quite got it. So I understood like what you were saying about how you want to kind of verify, like if you refer to a source or get ChatGPT to refer to a source, you want to kind of vet it yourself to see how it did in terms of respecting usage. I know that like say I just ask for a worksheet. I mean, ChatGPT could be drawing from anything, right, in the internet. So, and there's, of course, lots of times things get put on the internet that maybe the authors never intended to be there, or they're there and used in different ways. Is there anything you can do to kind of limit the sources ChatGPT draws from in general, like when you're not specifying, because obviously you can't specify anything, to try to make sure that you're not using material that violates copyright?
That's an interesting question, actually. I don't know if I know the answer to that. Something tells me like if you constructed the right prompt, you might be able to get it to draw from something specific and then, you know, reference it properly. But I guess the challenge is at the end of the day, we don't know where the output is coming from. It's coming from such a variety of sources, and there is a high likelihood that some of those sources are copyrighted. In ChatGPT, the T is for transformation. So, you know, their argument is that it's transforming that information so that those copyright rules don't apply. But I think that's left to be decided in the legal system, and there's not a lot of clarity on it right now.
I mean, so in terms of using, like, if I'm making worksheets for my classroom, there's not a great likelihood of, you know, publishers coming en masse to my classroom to check things out. But are there any standard, like for instance, you know, there's APA guidelines for writing papers, there's MLA. Is there anything like that that's been developed for how to use ChatGPT, or is it still kind of what you were saying earlier about how it's new and we're sort of creating the guidelines as we go within the institutions and organizations?
Yeah, I looked into this to try and find something that was kind of standard. And, you know, APA has guidelines on how to cite ChatGPT, but it doesn't have guidelines on how to, you know, recognize that you've used ChatGPT. The closest thing I could find was those publisher guidelines, and it varied by publisher. Some of them, you know, outright banned the use of AI, while others said, you know, you can use it for editing, but not for creating things. So I do think that at this point, it comes down to that transparency thing from the ethical side. From the legal side, it's still pretty unclear, but hopefully our institutions will be giving us some guidelines on kind of what their expectations would be. And I think that's a great question, Dana. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I just wanted to share here that in the reading that we adapted from the Canadian government website about renting a home in Canada, because there aren't clear, rules about this, and it isn't, I'm not citing, it's not a research paper where I might cite APA. In this case, I just put in adapted from the original website using ChatGPT. And, I'm hoping that in this case that'll suffice. At least it's transparent. But I think your question is a good one because even if it's, a classic skill building activity with fill in the blanks and it's, a grammar exercise, it's drawing from somewhere. Where is that? And how do I cite a thing that it seems to have produced, from scratch when it wasn't from scratch at all?
Thanks very much.
I think there's a couple of other questions in the chat. One about sharing this PowerPoint, which I think we will have it published with the recording. Is that right?
Yes, correct. As soon as the recording is ready, it'll be posted on the website. We will also share it with ISANS, and we will share the PDF version of these slides as well in an email either today or tomorrow.
And Wei-John was asking if we have some ready-made prompts that we can use directly for creating plans, self-reflection, etc.
You can use what you found in this presentation and play around with that, but I think the best way to use this is to just practice, play around with it, see where it goes wrong. It'll produce some really weird and wonderful things that you wouldn't have anticipated, but then when it produces it, you're like, oh, I see where it went. So just practice with it, play around with it, modify your prompts, and I think you'll get there. For example, when I first tried to have that conversation with AI as my coach or supervisor, instead it just produced, 3 pages of advice. There was no back and forth at all. And then the second time, it produced both sides of the dialogue. It wasn't interacting with me at all. But when I looked back at my prompts, I could see where I went wrong, and then I convinced it to, interact with me. But again, I would just suggest you play around with it.
Oh, Patrick has an interesting question there. Do you use the same parameters, role, requirements, etc., to generate images? I personally don't. I don't think it would be a bad idea to try it out. It might help me to get what I'm looking for more quickly. So that's something I'd like to experiment with, Patrick. What about you, Paul?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think maybe 3 of the 4 pieces of that could work. Like you probably don't need the role, but the task and the requirements you certainly would need. Yeah. And again, like I think the definition of the 3rd and the 4th part of that prompt guide is, it's kind of ambiguous. It's not clear why they're differentiated at all. So yeah, like I said, just play around with it and see what it produces.
I don't think I've missed any questions in the chat. If I've missed your question, please let me know. But otherwise,
I think we've got, we were also looking at the chat and I think you've got it all. Thank you again, Kelly and Paul, for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and expertise. I'd like to also thank our interpreters, Claudine and Jeannie, with our speak partner. And we've also put in the chat, we'll put it again, but there is an evaluation survey to fill out. So please do so. We'll put it's already there. We'll put it again. And as well, just a reminder that we have the 3rd webinar of this series on November 20th. Same time, so 3 p.m. Atlantic time. And the registration form will be also shared in an email, but also Victoria's just putting in the chat. So thanks again, Kelly and Paul. Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for being here. And we'll see you on November 20th.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.